開工啊！開工啊！開工！回腳！開工啊！
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone. What an amazing performance just now. Let's give them another round of applause. Good morning, everyone. My name is Han Li. I am a reporter of San Francisco Standard, and it's such an honor for me to be your bilingual MC today. I'll be providing Chinese and English translation today. 大家好，我是李涵，我是旧金山 San Francisco Standard 的记者。今天呢，我非常荣幸能够成为大家的双语主持人，我将会提供简单的中英双语翻译。So more than 100 years ago, tens of thousands of Chinese immigrants come to the United States with a dream of finding gold, and later many of them participating into building the transcontinental railroad, which helped build the prosperity of today's America. So in San Francisco today, we will have an amazing exhibition honoring that history. 所以，在100年前，超过100年前，有非常多的铁路华工来到美国修筑洲际铁路，然后洲际铁路呢就帮助美国成为今天的美国强盛而繁荣。所以呢，今天在旧金山我们有一个非常好的展览来纪念这一段的历史。So in today's event, we will have distinguished guests giving remarks and also documentary screening and also a panel speaking program. 今天的活动中呢，我们将会有非常多的嘉宾致辞，同时有电影的放映以及有一个论坛 ，and most important lunch will be provided too. 今天也会有午餐的供应。So first of all, special thanks to San Francisco Public Library hosting this event and also hosting the exhibition. And first of all, let's welcome the city librarian, Mr. Michael Lambert. 我们有请图书馆馆长玄博高先生。
Thank you so much, Han. Good morning and welcome. I am Michael Lambert. I'm your city librarian. It warms my heart so much to see this Correct Auditorium full today. Thank you so much for coming out. I want to take a moment to acknowledge our elected officials in attendance today. We have District 1 Supervisor Connie Chan, our first Asian American City Attorney, David Chu. And I do not see District 3 Supervisor Aaron Peskin, but I understand he is going to be here today. I also want to recognize our amazing library commissioners in attendance today. The Vice President of the San Francisco Public Library Commission, Pete Wong, in the back of the room. Also, past President of the Library Commission, Teresa Ono. I also want to give a shout out to Marisa Pella, the Executive Director of the Friends and Foundation of the San Francisco Public Library. Thank you for all your support. There are so many incredible leaders in attendance today. We have the Acting Consul General, Pan Ching-jung. So I want to thank all of the dignitaries for honoring us with your presence today. I also want to thank all of you for turning out. After the past couple of years, it feels really good to pack the house and foster community in your public library again. We're going to have a great morning. I am so looking forward to the Going Home film directed by Min Zhou. And this event really brings to life the exhibit on the 6th floor in the Skylight Gallery, The Silent Spike, following in the footprints of Chinese railroad workers. And now I'm going to turn it back over to our MC, Han.
Thank you, Mr. Lambert. 刚刚呢，玄博高馆长就是非常开心，今天有非常多的人来到这个活动上，然后经过2年的疫情，他也非常就是感谢所有的嘉宾能够来到这里，然后同时也纪念我们这一段的历史。So next, let's welcome Miss Nancy Yulaw, the curator of this exhibition, and also the project director of the Chinatown History and Cultural Association. 接下来我们欢迎华埠历史文化协会的策展人 Nancy。Nancy 是我们这个展览的策展人，同时她也是华埠历史文化协会的创办人之一。Let's welcome Nancy.
Thank you very much for having me here. Good morning, Honorable Acting Consul General Ping Cheng Jiang, Honorable Chief Deputy Superintendent Mary Nicey, Honorable Supervisor Pat Skin, Honorable Supervisor Chan, and Honorable City Attorney David Chu. Guests and friends, thank you for coming. It is my honor to bring this exhibition to be displayed in the Ming Library with the trust and partnership of the Chinese Railroad Workers Descendants Association and the San Francisco Public Library. The goal of this exhibition is to provide the opportunity for the public to learn more about Chinese railroad workers, a critical part of Chinese history in America, with the help of the San Francisco Public Library. To accomplish this mission, unity among the various advocacy groups will be essential. Our hope is that the Chinese contribution to the formation of this country will be better represented in our textbooks and in school curriculums for our future generations to learn and remember. Your attendance to today's gathering has proved that consolidating all groups would make our community strong to fight against injustice and discrimination. This exhibition intends to show unity between traditional associations, the American-born Chinese community, historians across the country, scholars from various fields, descendants of Chinese railroad workers, and guests who support spreading awareness of Chinese contribution in this country. Together, we make our voices heard and make sure that Chinese American history is a part of American history. Okay, I'm going to do that in Chinese, but also do it in Cantonese only, Council General. 尊敬的潘興剛代總領事、加州教育局副會長、佩斯金市參事、陳思敏市參事、City Attorney David Chu， 各位嘉賓朋友，大家早上好。很榮幸在鐵路華工後裔和協會和三藩市公共圖書館嘅信任和支持下，能夠將今次展覽在圖書館展出。展覽目的是表彰鐵路華工對橫跨美國大陸中太平洋鐵路的貢獻，為了完成此使命，提倡不同團體團結一起，希望公眾有機會在三藩市公共圖書館嘅幫助下，能夠更深入了解美國華人歷史，也更加希望把華人在美國嘅貢獻納入我們的教科書，成為我們下一代學習和銘記的題目。今日嘅聚會證明團結所有團體，使我們的社區更加強大，讓我們一起發出我們的聲音，確保華人在美國嘅歷史成為美國歷史嘅一部分。多謝。
Thank you, Nancy. Next, let's welcome Ms. Connie Young Yu from the Chinese Railroad Worker Descendant Association.
Thank you. Thank you. This event today is like a brave new locomotive with a destiny. It tells the American story of Chinese people who did the impossible. Abraham Lincoln had the dream of a railroad that would unite the country. General William Tecumseh Sherman said, if the railroad were ever built, it would be the work of giants. Our ancestors were giants, and we stand on their broad shoulders. As representative of the Chinese Railroad Workers Descendant Association, I'm proud to say we are making strides in the footprints of our ancestors. As espoused by our founder, the late Judge Michael Kwan, the goals of our mission statement are to educate, to inspire, to unite. Education, by supporting archaeology work on railroad and pioneer sites, by producing exhibits, films, publications, musical performances, and curriculum development. We write books and we use social media big time to tell our stories. We explain why it took 150 years for national recognition of Chinese railroad workers by revealing the history of exclusion that made Chinese perpetual aliens. We get to the root of anti-Asian hate. To inspire, we promote our awesome history that is part of the American narrative. the stories of courage, endurance, and sacrifice, the incredible achievements of Chinese workers that united our country by rail. To unite by sharing our Chinese railroad workers' history of struggle and triumph, we stand on common ground with all immigrants and their descendants. You don't have to be a Chinese railroad workers to join us, but believe in our mission statement and the ideal of history with a purpose. We share a humanity, and we unite with all in opposing racism and injustice. These are big goals, like that impossible dream of uniting the country by rail. But together, we are making tracks. Thank you.
Thank you, Connie. Connie 央玉他是一位铁路华工的后裔，然后他刚刚也提到，铁路的华工完成了不可能完成的任务，然后同时也希望这一段历史能有更多的人知道。Next, let's welcome Dennis Law, the president of the Chinatown History and Culture Association.
帮我翻译。尊敬的中国之旧金山代总领事，尊敬的加州州议厅副厅长 Mary Nicely， 女士们、先生们，大家好。歷史見證將先賢功績、文化傳承顯子孫低穩。
So Mr. Law emphasized the culture and the history's importance.
非常高興，難得嘅緣分，鐵路華工後裔協會、三藩市總圖書館同埋我哋唐人街華埠歷史文化協會，首次有機會共同組織舉辦呢個活動。
Thank you to all the organizations participating into and make this into a reality.
今日特別高興，我哋有唐人街嘅僑領社區賢達。
It's such an honor that we have so many distinguished guests today.
我有嚟自各個地方嘅歷史學家、歷史教授，同埋各個地方嘅熱愛中國歷史文化嘅人士。
And we have a lot of historians and also lover of Chinese American history lovers here.
佢哋有啲講英文嘅，有啲講中文嘅，有啲仲講中英雙語嘅得。我哋濟濟一堂。
So some of them speaks only Chinese, some of them speaks only English, and we are happy that we are all together here today.
我哋希望通過呢個文字、圖片，去彰顯我哋先賢嘅功績。
We hope to use these pictures, this literature to show the contribution of our ancestors.
更加係表揚我哋華人在美作出嘅貢獻。
And also highlight the contribution of Chinese American in this country.
我哋希望通過呢個圖片展覽，能夠喺未來日子組織更加多嘅活動，構建更加多嘅平台，去宣揚我哋嘅文化。
We hope this exhibition will be a starting point of many, many more organizing from the community of showing our history and culture.
共同去講好我哋華人嘅故事，講好我哋唐人街歷史嘅故事。
To tell the stories of Chinese American in Chinatown.
令到我哋嘅文化歷史可以弘揚， 世代相傳落去。
Yeah, to let our history, our story being told, and letting many, many more people to know our history.
更加令到我哋嘅優秀中華傳統文化飄向世界每一個角落。多謝各位。
Thank you. To make our Chinese tradition all over the world. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Law. So next, let's welcome the Acting Consul General of the People's Republic of China in San Francisco, Mr. Pan Qingjiang.
Ms. Mary Nicely, Chief Deputy Superintendent, Mr. David Chu, City Attorney of San Francisco, Ms. Kenny Chang, Member of San Francisco Board of Supervisors, Mr. Dennis Law, Chairman of Chinatown History and Cultural Association, Mr. Michael Lambert, City Librarian of San Francisco, Mr. Liang Guoyuan, President of the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association. Dear compatriots, dear friends, a very good morning to you. It gives me a great pleasure to join you at the opening ceremony of the photo exhibition, Silent Spikes, following in the footprint of Chinese railroad workers. More than 150 years ago, tens of thousands of Chinese laborers came to the United States across the ocean. They overcame harsh conditions, endured unfair treatment, and completed the construction of the Pacific Railway with extraordinary perseverance and great sacrifice, which made important contributions to the economic and social development of the United States and created a legend in the history of human engineering. The construction of the Pacific Railroad epitomized not only the struggle of the Chinese immigrants, but also the contribution of the Chinese immigrants to the development of the United States, which should be duly recognized, respected, and remembered. Many thanks should be extended to the Chinese Railroad Workers Descendant Association, the Chinatown History and Cultural Association, San Francisco Public Library for co-organizing the photo exhibition. Your efforts are very much commendable, and we give you strong support. The photo exhibition will help us to relive the history and reflect on the future of overseas Chinese in the United States and the China-US relations. More than 150 years ago, Chinese laborers took root in the United States with their hard work, wisdom, and perseverance, continued to make contributions and progress. Regrettably, instead of getting the recognition they deserve, they became victims of the racial discrimination. Fearing that the capable Chinese immigrants would take the job opportunities, local workers began to discredit the Chinese and instigated the anti-Chinese movement. In 1882, 13 years after the completion of the Pacific Railroad, the US government introduced the Chinese Exclusion Act to put restriction on Chinese immigration, which lasted for decades. The practice of use it when you need, discard it when you don't has brought great harm to Chinese immigrants and made them suffer huge inequality. There are always some similarities in history. Under the leadership of the Communist Party of China, China constantly moves forward in its exploration and realizes long-term social stability and fast economic development by following the path of socialism with Chinese characteristics and adhering to reform and opening up. With its overall national strength and international influence continuing to rise, China is getting closer to the center of the world stage. In recent years, some forces in the United States, unable to adapt to China's growth and fearing that the United States would lose its hegemony, have resumed the old China exclusion path and kept on smearing and suppressing China. As a result, the China-US relations have faced severe challenges rarely seen since the establishment of diplomatic relations. While undermining the interests of the United States, it has triggered serious anti-Asia and anti-China social problems, posing great risks and challenges to the life and property security of many overseas Chinese in the United States. Dear friends, history and facts have proved time and again that suppressing and containing China and the Asian hate and the Chinese hate will ultimately hurt the interests of the United States and the people of the United States. A sound and a steady development of Sino-American relations serves the fundamental interests of both countries and meets the common aspirations of the two peoples. China-US relations are closely related to the vital interest of the overseas Chinese in the United States. We hope the mainstream of society in the United States will have an objective, rational, and correct view of China and China-US relations, and will respect and safeguard the rights and interests of overseas Chinese in the United States. We hope that the Chinese community can strengthen solidarity, refuse to silence, bravely stand out to safeguard their legitimate rights and interests with clear voice and positive action. We hope the Chinese community can well tell the Chinese stories to the people of the United States to help them to have a better understanding of China and to rectify the prejudice against and the misunderstanding about China. Through joint efforts, we contribute our due to help bring the China-US relationship back to the right track and build a Pacific bridge of friendship which benefits both countries and the world. Finally, I wish the photo exhibition a complete success. Thank you very much.
谢谢潘代总领事。刚刚潘代总领事有提到，就是在美国的铁路华工做出了巨大的贡献，然后这一段历史也应该被铭记。同时，他也提到当今社会美中关系存在一些挑战，他也希望美方能够保障在美华人的利益，同时也寄望中美关系友好发展。So next, let's welcome Mary Nicely, the Chief Deputy Superintendent of California Department of Education.
Good morning. Again, my name is Mary Nicely, the Chief Deputy Superintendent of Public Instruction for the state of California, and I am incredibly proud to be representing State Superintendent Thurmond at this important event today. I'm thrilled that my first in-person speaking engagement can be in this beautiful room with champions of the Asian American community that I've worked alongside for years as co-chair and member of the City and County of San Francisco's Asian Pacific American Heritage Celebration Committee. I stand before you the daughter of Burmese immigrants and the first Asian American and Burmese American to hold the chief deputy position at the California Department of Education. I tell you this because there have been many waves of Asians and Pacific Islander immigrants with unique stories to tell. But today we honor and appreciate the thousands of Chinese immigrant railroad workers who helped build the Central Pacific Western portion of the Transcontinental Railroad, thereby connecting the United States of America as one. And as I look at these photographs and historical images, I'm struck at the fact that these tremendous achievements came thanks to the 12 to 20,000 uncelebrated and unrecognized Chinese construction laborers who have all but been forgotten, even though they've built the spine upon which American economy relied and continues to rely on. They were often underpaid compared to American workers, not given the respect of housing, food, or citizenship. Thousands of Chinese immigrant railroad workers tragically lost their lives during construction, and if we didn't have these photographs and these stories of from descendants, their stories would be lost to history. And to add insult to injury, in the famous photo of the last spike of the Transcontinental Railroad being driven into the ground in 1869 in Utah, not a single Chinese worker can be seen despite them being the majority of the workers. This underlines the fact that we need to tell stories that have been otherwise erased from history. Our educators and students have told us there is an overwhelming need for tools and resources that promote an honest accounting of California and our nation's history, and for classroom spaces where students feel a sense of belonging and engagement and are able to see themselves reflected in the lessons taught in our schools. That's why the State Superintendent, Thurmond, and the CDE have worked hard to revise the Ethnic Studies model curriculum to better reflect a world today and what we know. I personally work closely with the chair of the AAPI School Board Members Association, Cynthia Chang, to ensure lesson plans reflecting not only the story of the Transatlantic Railroad were included, but the stories of Vincent Shen and the role of Chinese Americans in the civil rights movement, we're told. The past 2 years, we have battled not only the pandemic of COVID, but the pandemic of hate. In holding virtual student town halls across the state, including one with the San Francisco Human Rights Commission and CCYC, we've listened to our students discuss their fears due to the rise in hate crimes against the AAPI community and the tragic murder of George Floyd. At the department, we know that we must have increased conversations about race and racism in our own communities and as a nation. We must acknowledge that in our state and nationally, many groups have had unjust treatment from individuals and even respected institutions of authority. We must acknowledge that in many cases, curriculum taught in schools have specifically not done enough to highlight and preserve the contributions made and that continue to be made by Chinese immigrants and their descendants. We must dispel the myth of the model minority and the perpetual immigrant. Well-taught ethnic studies courses will benefit all students by increasing school connectedness, understanding of peers, and graduation and college-going rates. Our students have made it clear that they want to learn more about our nation's complex history in a way that is more representative of the world they've experienced and lived, in a way that represents them and their families' histories. As we re-examine as a nation the fabric of our society and history, we know that education is the key. And ethnic studies in particular can help shine a light on telling our history in a more honest and inclusive way. Now is the time to transform education for this generation. It's never been clearer that we must devote a special emphasis to teaching students about the struggles, histories, and contributions made by people of color and immigrants in our state and nationally. Thank you for allowing me to join you today, and thank you for this incredible exhibition, and thank you for continuing to teach this important history. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Mary 是我们加州教育厅的副厅长，然后她刚刚也提到，就是铁路华工贡献巨大，排除万难建造了铁路，然后今天的照片能够更好的让我们铭记那一段历史。然后她也提到了，在加州的教育体系当中有 ethnic studies， 也就是少数族裔研究，在学校中能够提供这样的课程，可以让学生们在学习中更好的了解美国的历史。So next, let's welcome Supervisor Connie Chan, 市议员陈诗敏。
Thank you for having me today. It's great to be here with you. If I may, since today we're really honoring the Chinese workers and their history, I'm going to start my remarks in Cantonese. 大家好，我係陳思敏，第一區市參事。好榮幸嘅今日能夠同你喺埋一齊。首先呢，因為我哋今日其實係諗一諗我哋華人嘅歷史。如果有呢個機會，我想首先嘅讓大家知道，我今日能夠成為三藩市嘅市參事，係因為我哋之前華人社區咁喺三藩市裏邊嘅悠久歷史，亦都係因為三藩市有好多好出色嘅女性，咁其中咧就係我哋而家喺在席嘅方李邦琴女士，仲有就係我哋嘅鄧孟思法官。因為有我哋呢啲咁樣出色嘅女性，今日我先至能夠成為三藩市嘅市參事。同樣嘅，亦都係因為有我哋嘅華人社區領袖，譬如我哋嘅中華總會館，今日我哋嘅主席係梁國元主席。仲有就係、我唔知道大家頭先聽唔聽到，頭先咧我哋一開始嘅時候，Robert Wong 嘅中文名我突然之間唔記得咗，但係佢咧上嚟嘅時候咧，我哋敲鑼啦。話開工，咁佢哋行入嚟嘅時候就話：鬼叫你窮啊，頂硬上！如果你係華人嘅時候咧，你就知道呢一句説話咧，係讓我哋知道我哋嘅華人，我哋嘅精神，就係當我哋刻苦耐勞嘅一個精神。無論我哋遇到點樣嘅困難，我哋都會刻苦耐勞去頂硬上。今日我相信呢一個紀念。就係讓我哋記得我哋嘅華人精神，所以希望我哋大家能夠記住，就算今時今日，我哋受到可能好多嘅種族嘅歧視，我哋仍然會喺美國立足頂硬上。So now I'm going to translate for myself.
Thank you.
I want to say that my name is Connie Chan. I'm District 1 Supervisor in San Francisco, and it's an honor to be here. But I wouldn't be here even if it weren't for the outstanding women came before me, especially in this Women History Month. And if I may, I want to honor, if I may again, Mrs. Florence Fang being here with us today, and Judge Julie Tang. They were the outstanding women came before me. And I wouldn't be here if it weren't for the long-standing history and the fighting spirits of the Chinese American community, like the Chinese Six Company, and that is our Mr. President Leung with us today. And for those who are the English speaker, probably did not realize what was that beginning ritual where we were hitting the gong and say, "Hoi gong," is meaning beginning to work. And for that, we see that the workers, they really are the Chinese Six leaders that came in and carrying out in a Chinese and Cantonese saying that 鬼叫你窮，頂硬上. It's like, so what if we're poor? We must continue. We must continue. So that is today why we're here, I believe, is to remember the Chinese workers and Chinese American spirit, how that when we face challenges and difficulties, we still stand strong. And today, even when we face anti-Asian hate, we will be reminded through this exhibition that we will stand strong and we will continue and fight on. So let's stay with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Chen, and your amazing bilingual skill. Do you have some certificate?
It's actually for Chinese History and Culture Association and Chinese Railroad Workers Descendants Association. And then you
Yeah,
speak
also
afterward?
we have Kelvin.
And then we'll take a picture and then Calvin will speak afterwards. Nancy? On behalf
Supervisor Peskin. Stand in the middle. Yes, yes.
Thank you so much. And we also have Kelvin Yan from Supervisor Peskin's office.
Hello, everyone. My name is Calvin. I am here, Calvin Yan, on behalf of Supervisor Aaron Peskin, who oversees District 3 of San Francisco and oversees the community that is Chinatown and North Beach. It is also my honor to be his assistant here with you today because as an immigrant myself who live in Chinatown, who live a block away from the Central Police Station, it is an honor for me to be in this event where we witness and commemorate our ancestors and descendants of the Chinese railroad worker who made it possible for me to be here, to made it possible for Supervisor Chan and all the electeds and all the Chinese leader here today. I still remember as a person, as a SFUSD student going to Gene Parker, my mother signed a field trip form to Angel Island, and she was the one who asked me, what is Angel Island? And that was a moment that remembered me while I had the privilege to went through SFUSD and education of learning the Chinese American history and the folks who have built the railroad for me. The folks who immigrated here, new immigrants, might not have the opportunity to learn the history of our ancestors who made it possible for them to even fly to here. And while a lot of them took the boat or maybe even swim to America through many other means, traveling different countries, she has not the opportunity to learn that. And that's why it's my honor and my privilege to be here today and to learn that this exhibit will be here in Public Library for the entire San Francisco, both visitor and resident, to really understand the Chinese American history and the complex identity that is being American. So I thank you for Nancy, thank you for Dennis, thank you, City Librarian, for having this opportunity today. Thank you. And I'll translate myself in Chinese really quickly too. Yeah. Yes. Han, you're really busy, huh? 大家好，我係殷錦浩啦，代表市參市佩斯金。咁佩斯金咧，佢就係代表第3區嘅市參市，係華埠嘅市參市啦。咁我自己咧就好高興今日可以同大家慶祝呢一個嘅活動啦，因為自己咧小弟都係一個移民。我記得咧，我細個嗰陣時咧，有好榮幸就可以喺三藩市嘅聯合校區咧就讀書。咁我媽媽咧細個嗰陣時咧就記得佢簽一份嘅平安紙就批准我可以去天使島去旅行。佢自己問翻我天使島係乜嘢嚟嘅，咁我先發覺咧原來我自己有榮幸學到喺美國華人嘅歷史，知道天使島嘅重要性。佢自己都係一個華人，佢自己同我一齊飛過嚟呢度移民，佢自己唔知道。所以咧，今日呢一個嘅活動咧，同埋喺華埠喺圖書館呢一個展覽咧，重要嘅唔係淨係為咗我哋下一代，其實重要嘅係為咗我哋好多嘅移民、新移民，可能冇機會喺美國喺三藩市學識華人、美國人嘅歷史，係令到我哋咧加深咧喺美國咧好多種族嘅問題啦。咁所以咧，我都好多謝我哋所有嘅舉辦單位同埋圖書館咧舉辦呢個活動咧，令到我哋大家都可以深入了解美國華人嘅歷史同埋一個嘅重要性。Thank you。
Thank you, Calvin, and thank you for your amazing bilingual skills. And next, we have the presiding president of the Chinese Six Companies. 接住落嚟，我哋有請中華總會館總統梁國元先生。
尊敬的中华人民共和国驻旧金山总领事馆代总理的领事的潘胜光、王坤领事，尊敬的西探市陳思敏、大法官鄧文思、佩斯金。主席羅玉航、羅怡嘅西，女士們、先生們、朋友們，大家好。今日我非常高興同大家一樣嚟參加由鐵路華人後裔協會同埋華埠歷史文化協會以及三藩市圖書館聯合舉行嘅展覽開幕典禮。中島嘅圖片讓我哋進一步了解到前輩嚟到美國嗰個艱難困苦嘅悲慘生活。沒有佢哋嘅辛勤勞動，哪有橫貫美國洲際嘅鐵路呢？唔好佢哋嘅空宵達達嘅同埋22計日嘅工作，哪有美國嘅強盛？但係而今還侮辱同埋欺凌我哋嘅華人，我哋一定要團結起嚟，團結就係力量，方能為中美友好鋪路同埋築起鞏固嘅橋梁。剛才大家聽到嘅頂硬上啊，鬼死你窮啊！嗰句話係我哋中國人嘅心聲，佢哋不為勞苦咁樣去工作同埋係一種我哋中國人嘅樂觀。所以前輩嘅功勞不可沒，我哋由此敬佩同埋尊重，永不能夠忘記，銘記心中。亦非常感謝你哋不辭勞苦，涉足各地，尋找華人修鐵路嘅等等嘅圖片同埋資料。及時舉辦嗰個有歷史性嘅非常有意義嘅展覽，讓我哋對前輩肅然起敬。祝展覽會圓滿成功，繼續發展下去。我謹代表中華總會館全體同仁及所有嘅華人共同祝賀同埋慶賀。多謝大家，祝大家身體健康。
多謝總統。So Mr. President Liang mentioned the Chinese railroad worker overcome a lot of difficulties and also highlighting the hardworking spirit of Chinese American. And he also asking the community to be united and let's work for a better world. So next, let's welcome our Chinese American community leader, Florence Fang, to present the certificate from State Treasurer Fiona Ma.
今天我代表我的好朋友，也是加州的财务长，发几个奖品和今天促成这个展览的朋友们哈。Now on behalf of the state treasurer Fiona Ma to present the thanks to the San Francisco Public Library and Chinatown Historical and Culture Association and the Chinese Railroad Workers Descendant Association. Please come down here.
Yeah.
Oh.
And let's take a group photo.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Florence.
You know, I like to say a few words. And after, listen to everybody's speech, and after I look at the pictures with Chinese, railroad workers, and I feel very deep touched. And 150 years ago, we Chinese come to this country, already make our contributions. And now, 150 years later, and our contributions is not only being recognized, but also the discrimination getting worse. I think everybody should have responsibilities to promote these true pictures and the true stories. For myself, I always want to build a museum and a memorial hall in San Francisco. And as a matter of fact, I already started. I just working with Bay Area Council and the Syria Railroad and the Heller and Manis Architectures Firm. Together, we already have an initiative planned. But I need everybody's support. I need State House support. I need Shibuya County, your support. I think together, we can make this dream come true. Thank you.
谢谢方礼邦琴女士。方礼邦琴女士刚刚有提到，就是她非常感动，看到了今天的展览，同时她也提到她正在建造一个博物馆来纪念这一段历史，当然也需要我们市政府的支持。谢谢她。And next, let's welcome Stephen Lee, our Entertainment Commissioner and also Chinese Railroad Worker Memorial Monument Project founder.
Morning, everyone. It's morning for me, too. As a third-generation Chinese American, my role actually is I'm more of a visual type of person. And my father and my mother was born in San Francisco. My father was born in a Chinese laundry, 17th and Mission. But in 1929, he went back to China to get an education because of the discrimination and also the depression. He came back, went to high school in San Rafael, and went to the war and did his job and came back, and we settled in Vacaville. So I'm from the suburbs, and unfortunately I don't speak Chinese like my friends and my community leaders here. So, and I think it was 2014, we had a meeting, CCN from Apapa. We met with Gordon Chang in Palo Alto. I was with Su Li from the Chinese Historical Society. And they were talking about him writing a book and doing the celebration for the 150-year celebration. And for me, I was sitting there going, well, how come there's no statue or any kind of representation that we can actually see? And there's some here and there in different cities up in the mountains, like Colfax and Auburn, but there's nothing really substantial that the people can actually be behind. So my job was, and my crazy job was to try to raise the money to build this statue. This is a model of the statue that we raised money, and Wilma and everybody, and the whole community went together to raise money. But we also wanted an artist that the people voted for. So we actually reached out to 18 artists. We had a big open call, and people voted for which artist that they want. And Professor Yang from Guangzhou actually is the winner because of how his display of what actually Chinese workers should look like, not the skinny laborer, but the strong laborer who actually built this side of the railroad. So in just about maybe 1 month before the final completion of the Transcontinental Rail celebration in 2019, and Connie did the best job ever to represent us Chinese American in Utah. We all went to Utah. And to actually stand on the ground, okay, this is my first time, stand on the ground where Chinese were not allowed to be, in front of the train. And as a third generation Chinese, and listening to Connie, and doing all the work and all the people I've met in 4 years, I educated myself. Because the young generation, and it's not in our school books yet, right? They're working on it. But I wanted something visual so that the young children can see. And right now, the actual statue, the full-size statue, is at the California Railroad Museum. They're holding it for us because we're going to build a plaza. And because of the API hate, we were going to put it up at Gold Run, where the first 500 Chinese were hired. But because of security, we're going to build, and hopefully build, next to the museum and have the monument. I don't want people to pay a ticket to go see this monument. So we're still, because of pandemic, we're still waiting. But it'll be there. And then send all your kids, your school kids, until we finally get a curriculum in the Chinese, in the American schools about Chinese railroad workers. In the meantime, enjoy it. We had a lot of organizations that support it, but a lot of money came from individuals. $10, $50, $100. And when you go to Sacramento see it, you just kind of like say, wow. So thank you so much, and I appreciate the opportunity. And as a third generation Asian American, that's my contribution to the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Lee. Commissioner Lee 是第3代的美籍华人，然后他也是这个雕塑项目的创办人。然后现在这个雕塑的就是真实的版本正在沙加缅度的博物馆，然后他也希望能够早日的，就是疫情过去，然后有更多的人可以看到这个雕塑。So next, let's welcome Connie Young-Yu again on behalf of Chinese railroad workers descendant.
Yes, I'm here again, this time to represent Stanford's Chinese Railroad Workers in North American project. I was part of this project. I invited, assigned by Professor Gordon Chang, to conduct oral histories of descendants. I knew my great-grandfather worked on the railroad, coming in 1866 from a village called Sunqun in Toisan, because my mother always told me he worked on the Iron Road, and she called it the Titlo, Zhou Titlo. But that had no details. But what I read growing up, or going to college, were the 2 bestsellers on the Transcontinental Railroad, Irving Stone's Men to Match My Mountain, and Stephen Ambrose's Nothing Like It in the World. These 2 noted writers used the same descriptions about Chinese railroad workers. And it was this: the Chinese were swarming like ants over the mountains. It was derived from the same 1867 newspaper. So as a descendant of one of the swarmies, I conducted over 50 history interviews with filmmaker Barry Fong, who videotaped. And it was an amazing experience. There were the typical stories, like my great-grandfather who came over at the age of 19 and sent part of his wages home to Sunshine and was able to send for his wife and his descendants. His sons were born in San Francisco, Chinatown. They fled the earthquake. All, these sort of a long story of generations. Following the paper trail, I learned, and other of our fellow descendants, learned of the struggles of descendants with immigration. How many of the descendants went through Angel Island? It was amazing. But there was memorabilia, a certificate of residence, the Geary, which was required by the Geary Act for this man named Jim King, and it was Zhao Qi on his certificate, who was working in the Delta. He had to carry this certificate with this photograph because of the Geary Act of 1892. And he was part of that group, thousands of workers and men, women, children who refused to register. Civil disobedience, because the Chinese six companies took it to court, to the Supreme Court, to challenge the constitutionality of the Geary Act, which extended the Exclusion Act for 10 years. And later it was permanent. But they lost, and he had to carry this certificate. And it's significant that it's dated 1894, 2 years after the enactment. So we learned from the paper trail, and it's amazing when we were interviewing people, the residents or the former descendants would bring out memorabilia that just was amazing. Like one was 2 equipment tags, and the equipment tags were from the Central Pacific. It said CPRR on one side, and the other one is Jupiter 60. That is the name of the Central Pacific engine at the meeting of the rails. This was in the possession of a descendant of a Chinese railroad worker. There are also stories passed down through the generations. We learned how the workers found wives. My grandfather was lucky; he was able to send for his engaged wife before the passage of the Exclusion Act of 1875, the Page Act. Others rescued slave girls like Jim King and married them and settled down in a place called Cortland, and the descendants became residents and pioneers of Locke. And the Locke people were just amazing because one of them was Bill King, was a flying tiger and was highly decorated, and his descendant had all his medals. And we interviewed Russell Lowe, whose father was decorated in World War II for extraordinary heroism with a Silver Star, and his uncle was killed in action, and his name is on the plaque at St. Mary's Square of the fallen Chinese Americans who made the ultimate sacrifice in World Wars I and II. So we learned of the sacrifice struggle against racism in every generation, but also incredible heroism. There were fighters from the railroad times to World War II. The railroad workers passed down a sensibility and the right stuff, because we feel as descendants we've inherited some of this right stuff. So we have a different point of view when we see the histories of episodes of the First Continental Railroad. We have a different episode, a view of these episodes that should not be forgotten, and we look at them differently than from white historians. And this is how it must be taught in schools. I have 3 examples. Building the railroad in the Sierra Nevadas. In the winter of 66, 67, a vanguard of Chinese towing locomotives and rails 28 miles over the summit, the building of 15 tunnels in the Sierra Mountains. Think of it when you go to Sugar Bowl for skiing. But also think of their courage, daring, the lives lost, but also how the survivors had camaraderie. They were cousins. They were from the same village. I walked through this 1,600-foot summit tunnel and saw the circle and Outside, I saw a circle of rocks around a campfire. What was a campfire? Where our ancestors cooked their food, and I saw shards of their porcelain bowls and their gaming tokens and their coins. Number 2, the strike in June 1867. 2,000 Chinese struck and refused to work, demanded that they be treated equal to white workers. They stood up for themselves and demanded $40 a month, 10 hours a day, and 8 hours in the tunnels. As told by Charles Crocker, this strike was easily put down. He cut off supplies and fired the strike leaders. It was over. But what actually transpired was that the Chinese knew they had the upper hand, and they did win some concessions. Most importantly of all, they gained respect, and they struck fear in the hearts of the Big Four. Third, 10 miles of track in one day, April 1869. It is well known as a feat unequaled in history, but it was the spirit of the people doing that is not recorded. When told of the plan, Chinese workers were all for it. They wanted to show what they could do. It was an incredible organization of cars, carts, horses, and equipment, and the teamwork of Chinese track layers and 8 Irish rail handlers. So there was incredible trust and cooperation and teamwork that is not documented. This should all go down in history, the stories of the humanity of our Chinese people building the railroad, their character, endurance, and dauntless courage. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Connie Young Yu. 于荣一方他是铁路华工的后裔，他刚才也提到，他正在做一个口述历史的项目，希望能够留下更多当年铁路华工的历史。So next, let's welcome Anna Ng, the faculty member of UC Berkeley's Asian American Studies.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Anna Ng. I research and teach Asian American Studies and Women and Gender Studies at San Francisco State and UC Berkeley, where the focus of my research has been on the 19th and 20th century Chinese American women and families. However, I'm not here to speak to you as an academic, but rather from a more personal perspective. As a fifth-generation descendant of a 19th century Chinese railroad worker and laborer, and to share with you what that journey has been like for me and my family, to rediscover and document and tell the story of my great-great-grandfather, Lei Du Tam. I wrote my first Chinese American history, not as an academic, but as a child, when I was about 8 years old. You know how that is when your teacher sends you home to write about your family and your American history? Well, of course, I grew up in a non-English speaking immigrant Chinese family, and we had only just been in the country for just a few years. So what could my family possibly tell me about American history? Little did I know that my non-English speaking mother was going to start telling me all these stories about my great-great-grandfather who had come to this country to work on the railroads. Now, of course, I'm 8 years old, and I'm kind of rolling my eyes and thinking to myself, sure, Mom, everybody who is Chinese is going to say they're descended from Chinese railroad workers. Everybody knows that. What other history do we have? But then she goes on in great detail to name names of all these people, how my great-great-grandfather would eventually be killed while digging for gold in a mining accident, where he would be crushed by a great avalanche and a cave-in. By now, my frustrated young self is struggling to document and transcribe all these details in Hoisan Chinese names into Romanized English characters while trying to figure out who is who. All I knew was that for 5 generations, this story had been passed down in my family from my great-grandmother, who was the daughter-in-law of a Chinese railroad worker and married to a Chinese railroad worker, and who raised us in China. My great-grandmother told these stories to her granddaughter, my mother, and now my mother to me. And despite all the details, we never knew exactly where my great-great-grandfather was killed and buried. His body was never recovered, nor sent home. Over the years, I quickly forgot about this historical project, assuming that if my mother knew these stories, they must already be well documented in the history books. As I got to high school, I don't recall learning anything about the Chinese, except perhaps a passing mention that we had perhaps worked on the railroads. By the time I got to college, it was the late 70s and early 80s, And while we had been influenced by earlier student movements at other campuses, UC Santa Cruz was still a relatively new campus. And we would be part of that first cohort that would stage hunger strikes to demand for ethnic studies classes. We hired our own faculty, we developed our own curriculum, we cobbled together our first Asian American Studies class. But that was just the beginning. In 1996, when I went back to school to work on my PhD, there were very few ethnic studies PhD programs. To stand here now should be a great accomplishment, but in many ways, it is still very bittersweet, because when I ask my students, what have they learned about Chinese American history, it is still often just one sentence, one paragraph, one page about the Chinese as railroad workers. And these workers are still largely nameless and faceless people, their stories devoid of families, community, and kin. While a small percentage of railroad workers were able to parlay their experience as labor contractors, translators, and go-betweens into merchant status, the majority were laborers, like my great-great-grandfather, whose reward for their hard work were 9 decades of exclusion laws and separation from their families and silence about that experience. It is my hope that by telling my family's story, we will start changing that narrative and encourage and facilitate other families to tell their stories, and that these forms of public exhibits will facilitate these kinds of conversations. By the way, after 5 generations of searching, this past fall, after my trip to Carlin, to commemorate the Carlin 13 for their reburial, they had been excavated, their bodies been excavated and languished at UNLV as human specimens to give them an honorary burial. On that trip, I finally discovered the exact location of where my great-great-grandfather was killed and buried. I hope you will stay after lunch for the panel, the discussion, to hear more about my story. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Anna 是 UC Berkeley 跟 San Francisco State 的 Asian American Studies 的老师，他也提到，就是他自己的家族有非常多的跟美籍华人早期华工的历史相关的部分，然后他也在逐渐的寻找。And next, let's welcome one of the best historian about Chinese American history, David Lei.
Thank you. I've been asked to do an impromptu reenactment of something that happened May 10th, 1969, because we're way over time. So the people here told me that I shouldn't come on stage to take up more time. So I'm reenacting what Phil Choi was put up with in May 10th, 1969. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And last but not least, let's welcome student Amy Zhang to give a few remarks.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Amy Zhang. I'm a first-year college student currently attending City College of San Francisco. Today, I will be talking about the significance of Chinese railroad workers and why our history books should detail their contributions. Prior to the exhibit here at the San Francisco Public Library, my knowledge of the Chinese railroad workers was very limited. It was shocking to learn that a huge part of the Transcontinental Railroad's success was derived from the hardworking immigrant workers that were severely mistreated and underpaid. Yet how could American textbooks so blatantly neglect the efforts of these immigrants? From the information we, the students, received of the Chinese railroad workers in our textbooks, were only of their participation in finishing the railroad. Thousands of Chinese railroad workers were hired with their willingness and desperations for jobs, though the textbooks fail to detail their work environments, struggles, and their own perspectives throughout. Additionally, we don't have many accounts for their personal experiences during their time building the railroads. Those that do voice their struggles would rarely be in our history books or would be left out entirely. Thankfully, their descendants would go on to carry on their stories. Still, some remain unheard. I want to put emphasis on pushing stories of Chinese railroad workers into our textbooks. As a first-generation Chinese American, I felt it's important to spread our knowledge and stories of our predecessors, even if we're not blood related, to keep them alive. After all, they ran so we can walk. During my time studying history, I learned about the contents of the Transcontinental Railroad through the textbook provided in my school. It was informative. I learned about how the railroad was built, the number of people it took, how much it cost, but I felt it was lacking in terms of recognition. I felt the need to better understand the Chinese immigrant workers, with whom I feel a strong connection with. My parents are immigrants too, and I witnessed firsthand the struggles and sacrifices they made to raise my brother and I in a foreign country. The same can be applied to the Chinese railroad workers. They gave up everything to move to a country that evidently rejected them. Yet, through the building of the railroad, they contributed greatly. I strongly believe that the stories and experiences of the Chinese railroad workers should be prominent in our textbooks. Not only will it give the voice to the voiceless, it will allow for future generations of Asian American kids to learn of the sacrifices, struggles, and perseverance the Chinese railroad workers exerted in order to shape our world into what it is today. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you for an inspiring speech. So now let's welcome all the speakers to be on the stage for ribbon cutting ceremony. 现在我们邀请所有的讲者上台剪彩。以及我们非常感谢今天所有的到场的嘉宾以及旧金山图书馆、Chinese Railroad Workers Descendant Association, Chinatown History Cultural Association, Lotus Fong, Larry Yi, Stephen Lee, David Lei, Connie Young Yu, Anna Ng, Barbara Voss, Min Zhou, Sandy and Edward Lau, Mike Mack, Lotus Taoism Institute, Jen Liang Healing Center, Kevin Chen, MMM Happy Group, Mia from New Laiwa Flower Shop, and all the volunteers. Thank you very much.
Ở前面嗰個。
開工。
I'm Scott Moore. I myself grew up in Nebraska. I moved to California in 2007. I started to understand and see pride in the history of that heritage. I really started to understand how much that meant. Papa came to Union Pacific when he said we want to have a celebration. And our idea said, well, how about a train ride, going over the exact location that their ancestors built this.
I want to recognize a few people, especially you see Davis. Is it a great day for a train ride or what?
So we've had this trip planned and on our calendar for about 6 months. This train left Omaha last Wednesday, arrived in Oakland, then Friday morning. Then of course was ready for this trip, and after we're done, it will head back to Omaha and get ready for its next trip.
You know, this is a private car. This is a VIP train, as a matter of fact. And this is what all of the presidents and the CEOs, this is their train. Whenever they want to go somewhere, we would call a taxi, okay? They call a train. And this train takes them anywhere in the country that they want to go. As a matter of fact, this train looks better than all of our homes put together. Some of the trains have dining rooms with beautiful oak tables and chandeliers and silver. If you ever had a meal on the train with the VIPs, it's china. Beautiful china with the emblem of the railroad on it. Really first class.
My name is Gene O, initial Chan, and O stands for Aoyang. That what came from my father's name, Kwan Aoyang Chan. So I got the Chan, but it's on my mother's side that came from the railroad. My mother is Lillian King, and his father, my grandfather, is Tai King, and then great-grandfather is Jim King. So all the time that when I was growing up, my mother was trying to write up the history of our family, the family tree. She always said that Grandpa came from the railroad, but he was only 16 when he came. He came in 1855, and he worked with the miners before the railroad. Yeah, that's where he got his name, from the miners, see?
In the winter of 1864, what California was short of wasn't gold, but laborers. The Central Pacific Company faced a severe labor shortage. Chinese workers were suggested, but it was doubted because they were so small, could they do such hard work? The Chinese built the Great Wall, didn't they? Charles Crocker's words ended people's questions.
I thought Chinese were small and very weak.
年代末60年代初的时候，那个金矿呢开采呢已经是基本是枯竭了。现在就在淘金的工地上面就招了差不多有70、80个人吧，去干了一段时间，非常满意，工作效率很高，而且呢很守纪律。就这样，斯坦福呢被收复了。那么克勒凯他底下这些人呢，跟我们台山那个水楼的这些李氏的这些兄弟们。 特别是他们当中呢，年纪比较大的，像李天佩呀、这个李幼琴呐、李天宽呐，这么些人呢，就有交往。现在就把这个任务呢，就交给李天佩他们，所以你负责帮我就招华工。像那个李天佩啊、李天宽、李幼琴、李义德啊，他们这些李氏水楼的李氏兄弟， 就组织了一个公司，就专门负责呢招募这个铁路华工。他们先是在美国招一部分，然后呢又回到香港，大量的是回到自己的家乡啊台山，特别是水楼。那个李天佩啊、吕幼琴啊，他就是属于这个水房系的。我们在那个水楼进行那个调研的时候，水楼那些乡亲们就跟我们讲，说我这个爷爷那一辈啊，都是跟着李天佩他们到美国去修铁路。
By the time the Central Pacific Railroad was hiring mass Chinese laborers to work on the railroad, Jim King had been living in the San Francisco Bay Area for more than 10 years. He was one of the few Chinese workers who could speak English, so he was hired to recruit Chinese laborers from China. He was often called upon to interpret whenever there was business to be conducted between whites and Chinese.
当那个做路华工的，实际上就是一些破产的农民，或者呢虽然有一些没破产，但是家庭的这个生活过得非常非常艰难，很愿意去海外播一下。就是我们现在缺的资料呢，就是说家乡的这些人究竟什么人去了都没有记录，那边他那个公司里面也没有记录。到那边以后，谁死了，谁的骸骨运回来了。也基本没有记录，没有保障的。
The Chinese did an amazing things when they built these tunnels because it was an impossible feat. And the reason they got the idea, they thought about the Great Wall of China.
你有没有觉得150年前华人的地位和今天华人的地位有巨大的变化？
是的，现在的华人呢，可以说已经轮过美国的各个阶层。这个活动呢，我觉得是非常有意义的。这在于呢，就是中国我们的劳工啊，150年以前，曾经呢就是跨过太平洋，参与了美国的这个西部的开发，通过参加这个太平洋铁路的修建，这个为他们做出了一个非常卓越的贡献。
Sure. If you get close enough, it'll be out of focus.
1867, there was an avalanche at Donner Lake. They give at least 35 Chinese workers were killed because the house and the building they were in was caught by the avalanche. So it was extremely hazardous working, not only the terrain itself, but the weather conditions here.
They were treated very badly under very difficult situation, and yet they worked so hard to help America to build the first transcontinental railroad. And the most difficult part of the road is the west portion.
This train left Omaha last Wednesday, arrived in Oakland then, Friday morning. Then of course was ready for this trip, and after we're done, it will head back to Omaha and get ready for its next trip. Thousands of people that came over to help build an American dream, quite honestly. So without that workforce, thousands of workforce that gave huge sacrifices, it may have never come together.
Late 1866, early 1867, and then they got caught, they got stuck because of the tunnels.
Central Pacific was in a big race with the Union Pacific, so they had to figure out ways to make it go faster. Normally tunnels are built from each side. In this case, they said, let's actually drop a shaft right down here so there'll be 4 faces that we can actually use to build this tunnel, and it'll go faster. They could move this at 1 foot per day with black powder, but it would double to almost 2 foot a day with nitroglycerin. So it was much easier, much better to do it that way. Well, the downside of nitroglycerin is it's very unstable. And so in order to reduce the risk during transportation and things like that, they actually put a chemistry lab up at the top of the mountain here where they formulated the nitroglycerin, and then they would put it in vials and they would take it down. So when they had either the nitroglycerin or the black powder all packed into those long holes that they really cut into the granite, then they'd set the fuses in there, and one person would jump into the buckets. They'd go right up. That was the end of their shift. That one person who remained down, he got the job of lighting the fuses. And when he had the fuses lit, he jumped in that bucket and up he went. And then there was a big explosion, and that was the end of their 8-hour shift. And then another group came in to clear up what had happened before.
Because of that, then they brought the crews down to Truckee because they were having so much trouble up on the summit. They brought crews down to Truckee and started laying track between Truckee and Reno. The government had advised the railroad that they wouldn't give them any more money or land to sell until they had rail on the ground.
Nearly 30 years ago, I was living down in the Sacramento Valley area. In the summertime, it was so unbearably hot. I went to Sacramento, Roseville, Auburn, Colfax, and it was still too hot. So I jumped on a train and rode it up to the summit. Instead of 105 degrees, it was 75 degrees, and rolled on through the little town called Truckee, and it looked like a nice little town. There I found out more on the history of the railroad, because Truckee is a major railroad town. It was very important in the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. I found the idea that there was a large Chinese population in this Wild West town in the mountains of California. And I thought of just this juxtaposition of this Oriental culture right in the midst of a bunch of, gunslingers and drinkers and miners and white people that carry on like white people all the time. And somehow they managed to get along for a while. But then I wondered what happened to the Chinese and why they're not here anymore. And I found out things turned kind of bad between the two peoples, and the whites kept pressuring the Chinese to leave because they were fearful of the Chinese taking their jobs, and they didn't understand the Chinese customs and habits, and they were just, they were kind of racist, a lot of them. And so eventually the Chinese did leave. One of the interesting stories up here, especially to myself, is it's a fish story, or a couple of fish stories. Years ago that the Department of Fish and Game had stocked these lakes up and down the Sierras with catfish, and no one knows for sure how they got there. But one theory is the Chinese brought them, and they stocked ponds with catfish so they would have a constant source of fish to supplement their meals. Historian Mark McLaughlin, written a lot of articles on the life of the Sierras here and the weather. He makes a pretty good case for it. It's possible, but there's no documentation per se for either of these. And so I feel at liberty to offer the possibility, and that the catfish were stocked by pioneers in the early days, sometime in the years after the Donner Party, because the news of that, the tragedy of the Donner Party, when so many people starved to death, must have got around and got back to other pioneers and immigrants coming over the same pass, and someone decided maybe it'd be a good idea to have some fresh food stocked up there in the lakes.
Their environment was transitory. High Road to Promontory has a listing in the back of each camp and when it was completed. You can gauge how often they moved the camps. They were tired of working on the railroad and they stopped and they started trying to create their businesses here. They were very successful for quite a while.
These here are the original iron shutters and doors that were installed by the Chinese to prevent fire damage. When the old Chinatown behind Truckee Old Town was burned out several times, the Chinese finally decided to agree with the Whitetown people and relocate here across the river on the south side of the river. And so they moved in December of 1878, when most of them moved. But this building already here, and pictures show that it goes back at least as far as 1876. The deal that was made through one of the Crocker brothers who owned this land originally, and the Chinese traded their lots in Old Town for this one, and it was approximately from the river, it went 400 feet up the side of this hill, and then 700 feet south or east, and then back to the river, and then back to this corner. So that was the size of the plot of land that the Chinese built their new homes and shops on.
There was only 2,500 people here when I came in 1977, so it never really was a big town.
When the Truckee Republican newspaper declared on January 13, 1886, quote, "Either the whites will rule and the Chinese must leave, or the Chinese must rule and the whites will leave." And this large stone was evidently deposited here by a glacier thousands and thousands of years ago, and it is believed that the Native American tribes that lived in the area used to dry their food up here. McGlashan, along about 1890, managed to take possession of this hilltop, and he first erected a tower and a shelter over this stone, and he turned it into a pavilion, and he enclosed the area with windows, and he housed his butterfly collection in here, and it was a museum for people to come visit. And there were also some relics of the original Donner Party that they had left at their campsites, musket balls and tools and parts of wagon wheels and whatnot, and so it became a kind of town marker.
Morning.
Morning.
My family's been in this county, which is Nevada County in California, since the 1860s. They had worked in the mines, had worked on the railroad, and had been in this Truckee area since that time. I became involved in the history of trucking when my father moved here in 1960s. I became involved mostly with the 601 and the history of the McGlashans. Mostly in high school, the stories we used to hear of the Chinese treatment, the Chinese method, the Trout Creek outrage, Sinmoy, and so forth. I have done a number of research on that. I've also talked to some of the old Italians that had family dating back to that time period, mostly 1886, when the 601 and McGlashan came to a head against the Chinese. 601 stood for 6 feet under, 0 trials, and 1 bullet. The term undesirables is used to intimidate the Chinese. They also use a term called elements. Elements was another way of whitewashing politically correct terms or incorrect terms, however you want to define them. The point on the plaque here is that this is still an example of whitewashing. In this town, there is no plaques dedicated to the Chinese railroad workers and laborers that built this town. This is one of the plaques, but they don't use the word Chinese. And it's really sad because the construction workers are deserved, well, I should say deserve much more than just a single plaque. They deserve a monument to be built in their name. And you get a better idea of the wagon road now. Same here, man. If you look here on this side, you can see the core of the hole right down. Not many people say that. 30, 40-foot cornices just come down here and boom. But
and that's the little one. And the big China wall is down below. That holds this whole bank up.
what's that?
Guys climbing up the
Yeah.
There could be a 3, but I might not have 3 in me, so.
You got this.
I can play it. I don't know if it'll sound good.
Well, this is just proof of concept, because this will get put out and we'll attract, maybe we'll attract some more players. We can got a whole 2 years to rehearse it to the Golden Spike.
69.
That's right. I'm wearing hiking shoes covered in snow.
Yeah, next time, not concert shoes.
Again. Okay. Little bit, just a tiny bit of breath, like just a tiny bit of space.
Gene retired after serving 34 years as a chief rocket engineer with a Sacramento missile propulsion manufacturer. His family has a 6th generation now.
And it's really, you think back about 150 years ago, the Chinese workers that came and built the Central Pacific and built through these Sierra tunnels we're looking today, were really starting to build America as the Transcontinental Railroad connected America back down. But without that workforce, thousands of workforce that gave huge sacrifices, it may have never come together.
What an amazing documentary. Let's give the director, Min Zhou, another round of applause. So now let's have a panel discussion to further the discussion about our Chinese American ancestors who helped build the Transcontinental Railroad. And let's welcome the moderator, George Chin, and the co-host, Veronica Peterson, and the 4 panelists, Min Zhou, David Lei, Anna Ng, and Barbara Voss. Let's welcome them on the stage.
Okay. Thank you, Han. Wow, look at the crowd. Thank you. Appreciate everybody staying behind. And I'm really happy and glad that we are able to gather these 4 panelists to join us today, and along with my co-host, Veronica. How are you doing?
Good. How are you, George?
Good. Great. Everybody enjoy their lunch? Yeah? And the movie? All right. So the exhibition, the film, and everything that we brought to you is hopefully to get more awareness of the railroad worker history, obviously. But we also want to raise some questions, and that's why we have this discussion group this afternoon. So let me first introduce Veronica. Veronica is a PhD candidate at Harvard University, and she is really interested in, she's actually an anthropologist candidate, but she's interested in archaeology, learning the foodways of our ancestors. What did they eat? What are the common people eat back in those days? So, so with that, Veronica, why don't you take over a little bit and tell us about you?
Thanks so much. Thanks, George. So it's an honor to be here today and facilitate this discussion with our great group of panelists. Like George mentioned, I'm a PhD candidate in anthropology at Harvard University, where I study the foodways and historical archaeology of the 19th century, early 20th century Chinese Americans and in the home villages in Guangdong province too. So today I'm really honored to introduce our four panelists. I'll start with Min Zhou first. Min Zhou is an award-winning journalist and filmmaker based in the San Francisco Bay Area. She focuses on Chinese American immigrant stories and brings long-forgotten histories into light. Some of her notable films include, I'll read their names, a trilogy, The Builders of the Iron Road, which we saw an episode of. Our Story of War and Remembrance, Chinese American World War II Veterans of the China-Burma-India Theater, and also a film called Going Home, A Journey to Ashland, just to name a few. Min works part-time in Silicon Valley with the U Channel TV, which is the largest nonprofit Chinese community television station in North America. So thanks, Min Zhou, for joining us. Next to Min Zhou, we have Barbara L. Voss, who is a professor of anthropology at Stanford University and also the director of the Stanford Archaeology Center. Voss is a historical archaeologist who studies the dynamics and outcomes of transnational cultural encounters, worked on Spanish colonization projects in the Bay Area, and since 2002 has been heavily involved in Chinese American, Chinese diasporic projects, including the San Jose Market Street Chinatown Archaeology Project, and on Stanford's campus, the Chinese Railroad Workers in North America Project, and most recently, the Arboretum Chinese Labor Quarters Project, which is an excavation on Stanford lands exploring the lives of gardeners and workers at Stanford. So thanks, Dr. Voss, for joining us. Okay, and then next to Dr. Voss is David Wiley, who was born in Taiwan to Cantonese parents. He's lived in the Bay Area since 1956 and married with one adult daughter. And David is a UC Berkeley graduate with a business degree and has given talks on Chinese American history and Chinese culture at institutions like the Commonwealth Club, the California Historical Society, the Chinese Historical Society of America, the Asian Art Museum, and the Chinese Culture Center. He was a commencement speaker to the UC Berkeley class of 2019 at Memorial Stadium. And David is here today because he feels it's imperative to interpret Chinese American history and Chinese art, culture, and rituals in the American context. So thanks for joining us. And finally, we have Professor Anna Eng from the Asian American Studies and Women and Gender Studies at UC Berkeley and SF State. She specializes in 19th and 20th century Chinese American women and families. We heard her speak a little bit earlier, and she'll speak more on that in this discussion. Eng is herself a fifth-generation descendant whose family grew up with their great-grandmother, who was both the wife and the daughter-in-law of Chinese railroad workers. And for 5 generations, their families were separated by the Chinese Exclusion Act. So thank you for joining us. And I think what we'd like to do today is I'll pose a sort of one opening question to the panel, everyone will have a chance to respond. And then we'd love to open it up to the floor to any questions that the audience might have. So we should be someone with a microphone. And so if you have something you want to ask, just raise your hand or stand up and someone will come to you. And we also can do this in multiple languages. So, we've, because of the sesquicentennial, the 150th anniversary of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, there has been all this flourishing, delving into the history about the railroad workers and trying to, mark their achievements. But I'm wondering, in your own respective fields, what do you see as the new directions of historical research, community history? And so I'd like to start with Min.
Should I start here? Okay, thank you so much for coming. This Crossing the Summit, I finished like 4 or 5 years ago, so for me it's old. But since 2017, I've been focused on the filming about the Chinese railroad workers' history. So I finished 5 of them, 5 short documentary films, and what you just saw was one of those. Recently, I finished Going Home, which is a 36 version documentary about Collins' story. Collins is a remote city located in Nevada. So that's part of the history of the railroad also. And I think my next project will be, I'm doing 2 short documentaries. One is for Honorable Judge Michael Kwan. And he's the person behind the 150 years anniversary. And he's the community leader too. So, and also I'm showing you the trailer I finished last night. And the second project I'm doing is called Waking Up Terrace. Terrace is a ghost town on the old grade route on the Central Pacific Railroad, also in Utah. So I participate in 2 archaeological surveys there. So one in 2020, one in 2021. So living 2 weeks, camping in the ghost town. And I filmed everything. That's my second short documentary. Okay.
So I'll show the trailer for...
You let me know when you're ready?
Yeah, I'm ready now.
Okay.
We worked very closely together to make sure that the Chinese railroad worker story was told. It was an incredible feeling. She walks triumphantly to the stage.
In the spring of 1869, out of the mountains into the desert of Utah, Chinese went from 6 inches a day building Summit Tunnel to laying 10 miles of track in 1 day.
This is what Michael said to me. He says, Max, we made history together.
He's an older brother, about 18 months older than me. Anything he did, I did, even when he was getting in trouble.
This is the largest gathering of descendants.
When I came back to Utah, he came to Utah. When I got into politics, he followed me there. When I started working with the railroad descendants and the state, he said, "This is important. What do you need me to do?" What I didn't realize is that any time I would say, "This is what I want to do," he would be the one doing it.
But without understanding the past had to go through, what Michael Kwan has taught us, we can never move forward. But because of his work, we will.
He cared about minorities. He cared about Asian Americans. Unfortunate that Michael passed away at the age he did, because if he had lived another 20 years, he would have been really an outstanding judge and an outstanding individual and a person who could have really made some big changes in the community.
Michael was a smart boy, real smart. He listened to me. Real good boy. No matter what, daddy first.
Funny, wise, and a nerd.
He was my hero. He was my best friend.
Thanks so much, Min. I'm really hopeful. I think it'll be, for those of us who are able to go to the Spike 150, we know what an important event it was and what an achievement it was to put on such a large event that drew in people from all over the world, really. So really looking forward to your documentary. Barb, maybe you can speak to a little bit more about what the impact of the railroad research has meant for archaeology.
Sure, thank you. So I'm really honored to be part of this panel and really enjoyed meeting a lot of you during the lunch break and hearing the talks. As I was introduced, I'm a historical archaeologist, and what we try to do as archaeologists is recover the everyday experiences of people who are often forgotten by history. And so we go to the actual sites where people lived and worked and do painstaking research to recover the little bits left behind of the clothes they wear, the food they ate, the houses they lived in, or the tents or the shacks on the railroad work camps. We use scientific techniques to recover particles from the soil that tell us about the plants people ate, the environment, things like that. And what our goal is to do is to really be able to share with others what people's daily experience was of these massive historic events like the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad and the other railroads like it. We know that through archaeology, we can understand what daily life was like in a way that newspaper accounts or outside observers will never understand. And we've been very lucky and very fortunate to be partnering for over 20 years with Chinese American heritage organizations, descendants of railroad workers, and our partner researchers in southern China in Guangdong province at Wuyi University and the Provincial Institute for the Guangdong Provincial Institute for Archaeology and Cultural Relics to put all of these pieces together. So we have a lot of information that's already been published that's on the Chinese Railroad Workers of North America project website at Stanford University. And you can access all of that. It's free to the public. We try to make our research as transparent and available as possible. I'll just briefly mention a couple things that we're working on now. One of the things we know about the railroad was that for most Chinese railroad workers, this was a very short period of their life. They went on to work in other industries. They went on to found businesses. They established Chinatowns. They returned to southern China in the Pearl River Delta and built new villages there or became leaders in their home village. And an important part of Chinese railroad worker archaeology is considering not just the railroad worker camp itself, but all of the other places that Chinese migrants lived and worked and formed what we now know as Chinese American communities in the United States. And so my students and I'm happy to have Veronica here, as well as Jocelyn Lee and several other students who've been working with me, are doing research really all over the United States West to try to gain a holistic understanding of the Chinese American experience from that very inside-or-out perspective. We also, as I mentioned, are partnering with colleagues in Guangdong province to do archaeological studies in the home villages of Chinese railroad workers and other Chinese migrants and connect the experience of people in the home village with the experience of people in the American West. So I'm just really excited to be with all of you here today. This is such an important occasion. Thank you, George, for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Hi, I'm David Lay. I'm listed as a historian. Don't believe all that you read, and don't believe all that you see. I'm normally not invited to these Chinese railroad worker events because I'm a contrarian. I question everything. And I think some of the things we say about it and what we talk about it, we don't have the backing, the documentation for much of what we say. How many of you were at the 150th? Yeah, quite a few. I want to see any politicians here right now. See, that's the problem, right? They come, they're gone. The other problem, I'm seeing a lot of white hair out there. We don't see the younger people. Oh, there's one. My apologies. But that's our future. So one of the things I want to do is accumulate documents from the Chinese side. So much of what we have are based not from the Chinese side and based on people with agenda most of the time. So we're trying to gather materials in Chinese that's still in the communities. It doesn't go as far as the railroad, with the exception of very few, because we had the earthquake and fire here. But what we can gather, we're gathering and try to put them in institutions, mainstream institutions. And I always talk about, it's important to talk about our history and culture in the American context, because we are Chinese Americans. Our descendants won't look like us. They're going to be Americans with about 30 to 35% intermarriage today. In 2-3 generations, they're not going to look like us. So the story we're telling has to be in the context of who Americans are. We're talking to Americans as a whole. And part of what I feel why our history is not included in the American history is we keep our history in Chinatown. We keep them in historical societies that's in Chinatown where mainstream writers, mainstream documentary makers have no access. If they're writing in general about America, they have no access to this. So one of the things I'm trying to do is get people to be more aware of this, to keep their documents and donate them to mainstream libraries and organizations where mainstream researchers, writers have access. Thank you.
I think some of you have heard me speak earlier. My name is Anna Ng, and I'm glad I'm last here because then I can comment on those who came before me. I usually introduce myself as a fifth-generation descendant, but also a first-generation immigrant. And every generation of my family has been, because of exclusion laws, been in this country for, we are now 7 generations in this country. And every generation for 5 generations was, because of exclusion acts, because of separation of families, essentially had to be a first-generation immigrant. Most of you are familiar with being paper sons. But what that also meant for our families is a lack of acknowledgement of the pain and suffering that our families went through for, I would say, 9 decades. And I go back to starting with the Page Act in 1875, well through the immigration liberation laws of 1965, as really the duration. And that was the reward for what Chinese Americans were given for the labor and for what we contributed to the building of the economy of this country. If you think about the magnificence that we want to celebrate of the railroad and the building of this country and the uniting of this country to the economy of this country, what we were given was essentially this. And I would say, you know, while we have been valiantly to record the stories of those who have been able to stay in America, to become merchants, to celebrate, but I would say 80% of those who were remained in America were essentially like people like my great-great-grandfather, people who were basically separated from their families and their children for almost their entire lifetime. I did, oh, thank you, she did put the slide back up. And, you know, I have very well documented, you know, all the way, and it's been my mission for most of my life to put those stories back into the historical record, not just for the public, but for our families, for the healing of our families. And I would, you know, in terms of direction, I would like to see that this government, this nation, acknowledge the Chinese as one of the first and earliest immigrants to this country, behind, you know, the forced, you know, enslavement of African Americans, the genocide of indigenous people in this country. What has happened to us was essentially an ethnic and cultural genocide, if we were to think about it. My great-great-grandmother, who was here on the bowl, and you know, this road is essentially the railroad. Okay, and the reason I mapped these locations was because my great-grandfather was 14 when his father was killed in a mining accident, which was right after their work on the railroad. And these were the places that he documented that he worked for years, labored for years in places like Lovelock, Winnemucca, Elko, Carlin, and these were all along the tracks of the railroad. And essentially, while the men were here, their wives, their children, those of us who are their descendants, were essentially estranged from them, were not allowed to see. I have evidence from our family oral histories that maybe, you know, these men were allowed to go home once or twice in their entire lifetimes. And so these are part of the documented stories. And even after, you know, my family was able to immigrate here in 1964, my great-grandmother, who essentially was the daughter, she was still not allowed to come when my family left. She was in her 90s and 95, and because by that point in time, her husband had passed away, her son, who was in America, was a paper son, could not legally bring her over. We, who were her families, could still not legally bring her over under the stipulations of these laws, and she ended up going back to the home village in China, where she essentially, you know, passed, and for most of her life. But my celebration of the history is her story, because it's the story of people, of our resistance, of our resilience, of to not let those stories be forgotten. My great-great-grandmother told these stories to her granddaughter, who was my mother. And my grandmother is the young girl in the middle here, standing on the right. That's how old she was when her father went to America as a paper son. You know, and this is every generation of our story here in America in terms of our contributions. But my great-grandmother did not allow us to forget those things, and she told it to us, and she passed it down to us from generation to generation. And that's what I believe is also the important work that we have to continue to do. We have to destigmatize our history. We have to convince our communities. We have to teach our own communities our history so that we can actually talk about these histories. I'm very excited that Barbara is doing this work in the home villages, because that is a tremendous source of these narratives. Technically, if I wasn't able to be here in '65, I would still be in one of those home villages. Okay? And many of you, as recent immigrants, come from those home villages. And if you don't know this history, it's because it's not in American textbooks, but it's also not in the Chinese textbooks very well either, you know, in terms of being taught to us. And sometimes we need to bring the history out from within our own communities. I've been very excited to work with David as well, to work in Chinatowns, to access these Chinese sources, because one of the things that's been very difficult for me as a historian is I can't tell a different story when what is in the archives was not produced by us. What is in the archives has been produced by white American sources. The people have been able to have the power and the dominance to write the history for us, about us. And we cannot write a different narrative if the sources don't exist. Even if we as Chinese Americans write those stories, if we rely on the same sources, we are still telling the same story. And so for us, for my project, even as a historian, I work in women and gender studies because we believe in oral histories. We believe in those small stories. And the stories that we actually have to go into the community to actually excavate and create, to facilitate the surfacing of. And that's actually more labor than the physical writing of the history itself. And so I hope that by telling our family stories, I encourage you to interrogate your own family stories, to open up, to ask your elders, to document your histories, to not forget your stories, to archive the things that are in your homes, and to share them, in a way that we can meaningfully, like as David said, donate these to institutional archives so they are much more accessible to researchers for us to be able to tell a different narrative of what exists. Anyway, that was a long story.
So thank you all for talking about the sort of specific things you would like to see going forward. I forgot to introduce George. I don't know how, who is my amazing co-moderator. George is a co-founder and director of the CHCA, the Chinatown Historical Communities Association, and this is George himself was the son of a paper son, and didn't know your father until you came to San Francisco at the age of 11. So it's part of these telling, of these personal histories and things like that. In the spirit of that, I'm going to let George take over.
Thank you. Thank you, Veronica. And also, thanks everybody. Now that we have a chance to hear different perspectives, different point of view from professors, students of history, and filmmakers. I'd like to open this section up as a interaction type of situation. Han is back there with the microphone, so if anybody has a question for any one of us or open whatnot, on the corner there, huh?
Hello. Hi. So I think this speaks to what Professor Lei was saying earlier, and also what one of the speakers, Ms. Connie Yu, mentioned in her speech about the younger generations and also what we will teach them about this history. So I am a relatively new U.S. history teacher. So for me, my question is speaking more to what would you all want us to, or want me to pass on to the younger generation? Ms. Yu mentioned, for example, she said something really important would be the acts of protesting and strikes that the railroad workers put on for their own rights. So I guess what would the panelists also want to add to that list of mandatory learning for the newer generations?
Well, I'd be happy to start with one thing. I think that, there's a common portrayal of Chinese immigrants as sojourners who were here to work and then return home. And that stereotype is repeated in textbook after textbook after textbook. The numbers don't add up. What we see when we actually look at the actual immigration records is that European immigrants, Latin American immigrants, and Chinese immigrants all have about the same rate of return, around 40 to 52%. And so I think one of the most important things to counter is this really damaging historical stereotype that Chinese railroad workers and other Chinese immigrants were short-term occupants of the Americas. We know from our archaeological research, we have evidence of Chinese settlements dating all the way back to 1849 and all the way through that period. These are not just little episodes. So I think in thinking about how we teach the next generation, it's important to not just teach the gold rush or the railroad workers, but also teach the 1920s, the 1940s, the 1960s, to show that continuity and that continuity of presence throughout the history of the United States.
I would like to add a bit of what to teach to children: to be suspicious. Historian is one that won't believe anything. Show me, where's the documentation? And a lot of things are excluded, and a lot of things that's upstairs on the exhibition, I question. First of all, this is the Chinese Railroad Descendants Association exhibition, will they say anything poorly, badly about their ancestor? So from that, right away, I said, well, I gotta realize that, remember that. You mentioned a strike being so important. The Chinese struck. It was put down in about 2 weeks, but they struck. And that's left out. Of all the panels, that was left out. Decision of some people. And so what is important depends on what perspective you look at, what point of view, what story you really want to tell. But tell the children, be suspicious, and you want the proof to get to some knowledge of what really happened.
So, to answer your question, I would end one point. I'm a mother of a daughter who's in college now. So I hope my daughter and her generation to understand the hardship the Chinese railroad workers experienced 150 years ago, as well as the discrimination, as well as the challenges. And I hope our children appreciate their contributions, understand their challenges, and don't let the discrimination things happen again. Don't take any excuse to make any group, minority group, as scapegoats. So if our children can understand the history, can appreciate our ancestors, I think they would understand what they are supposed to do. So be appreciated, be respected.
I'm kind of surprised that David didn't talk about the 10,000, lawsuits that the Chinese filed, and many of the civil rights that we enjoy as Americans today were in fact fought for by the Chinese. Birthright citizenship, all of these things, and many things. The process of immigration law, many of these things. But I want us to also connect our histories to other groups as well. And for our young people to see across the aisle the commonality of our humanity and the commonality of our struggles, because I think that's something that's been very, very important, that the Chinese are constructed as perpetual foreigners. In many ways, if we look at history as students of American history, when we studied the Chinese, we will also, what we're really understanding is the study of American history, whether it is very similarities that happened and how African Americans were treated, indigenous people were treated, how Mexican Americans, Chicanos are treated today as undocumented immigrants. In fact, when I teach my classes, they are comparative race and ethnic classes, and my students find very, very much, they see the empathy across the board when we study this history, the commonality of what's happening. What happened in the 19th century is very similar to how things are constructed today in many ways. And I teach my students to be critical, analytic readers of the past so that they can understand the present.
Sorry, I would also add one point, because this has come to my mind. I think what I'm doing is a historical documentaries, but what I'm thinking, each of us will be part of history years later. So what we think, what we did, will be part of history. And what if we did something wrong, that's be wrong on history. So that's why I hope our children understand we do need to respect the history of our ancestors. And the whole generation, the Chinese railroad workers, the Irish workers, Mormon people, the Native Indians, they all contribute together in 19th century for this railroad project. Each of them has to be respected. Thank you.
I don't want to brand ourselves as victims of the racism at that time, the lower wages and all that. I think, Barbara, what you said about the early immigrants, a lot stay, like other immigrants. But more than that, we're always branded as we have famines, Civil War, a lot of fighting in Guangzhou, famine, flooding, all this. We were starving, so we had to come. But the documents don't say that. We probably heard about gold discovered here before the East Coast because we were 2 months away by boat. East Coast was 5 months by boat. So a lot came early 1849. And they were not the laborers, they were the merchants. By November 1849, 300 Chinese merchants met at the Canton restaurant on Jackson Street to hire a white consultant representative. His name was Salim Woodward. And you have to ask yourself, how many Chinese were there in San Francisco and California in November 1849? According to Hubert Howe Bancroft, there were about 700, 750. About half of them met to hire a white lawyer. If you were a miner, why would you need this? And how did they get this Chinese restaurant that can seat 300? You know, how long does it take for you to build a 300-seat restaurant? Furniture, ingredients to cook things. So they came with a plan to build a restaurant, to bring with them the furniture, the cooks, and the ingredients to seat 300 people in a restaurant. It wasn't the only Chinese restaurant. There were 3 or 4 of them by 1849, end of 1849. So these people didn't come because they were illiterate, because they had no choice. It took a whole year's wage, $50 to $60 to buy passage. And these people, they all came from China because it was 2 months away. East Coast was 5 months, or if you walk across, 6 months. So we have to rethink this history, the importance of China, Hong Kong, to the growth of California, the whole West Coast. In fact, the miners sent their laundries back to Hong Kong to wash. That's how important it was. I don't have documentation on that, but I see that in a lot of books. Anyways, I think we have to go back and question everything.
Thanks so much for that really great question. There's, Dr. Ross mentioned there's also the Chinese Railroad Workers in North America website, which is housed through the stanford.edu. There's really a lot of good resources for teaching about this history there. So I encourage everyone to check that out.
We're running about at 2:20. I think we're okay, right, Nancy? We keep going? Yeah, so I appreciate everybody staying at this long day. Any other questions from the audience or comment? There's one over here. The microphone.
She's asking what is a paper sun.
What is a, oh, sorry.
I can explain what is a paper sun. Paper sun was a process. Essentially, you know, Chinese, we were undocumented. By the Chinese exclusion law, we were not allowed to, as laborers, bring our wives and families. And so many Chinese, in order to circumvent the immigration laws, would, if they were merchants, they were allowed to bring their families. And so many of these merchants might go back to China and then claim that they had given birth to a child. And then these papers could be used by other families or relatives or something to essentially legally be allowed to bring a child into this country. And so that was a way that families could circumvent the immigration laws and such. I would say that it is a strategy of resistance. You know, when immigration laws are are unjust, really, when you think about it for 90 decades for those people who were here that wanted to reunite their families. I mean, I have documented, history from my own family that, and I think, debunking this sojourner thesis has a lot to do with it because, the sojourner thesis has constructed something that we didn't want to be here, that we really didn't want to be here and our wives and children didn't want to come. But the evidence doesn't support that. Or through the decades of, kinds of things that were happening in China, when you're talking about famine, wars, the Japanese occupation, the struggles that families did try to reunite their families, it just doesn't add up to the narratives that say that, we liked being separated for 90 years. So.
I would like to ask Barbara about some exciting new archaeological finds from Stanford and generally along the railroad. And I'd like to include Veronica to share about what she found in Marysville.
Wonderful. Well, let me back up and say that for the Chinese Railroad Workers in North America project, we assembled a group of over 110 archaeologists working all over the American West to bring together information from archaeological projects that have been done on railroad workers' sites, not only on the Transcontinental Railroad, but also on other railroads where there were significant amounts of Chinese labor, the Northern Pacific, the Southern Pacific, the Canadian Transcontinental, and all the little branch railroads and regional railroads that also resulted. I think everyone has, all archaeologists have a favorite artifact, right? And I'll tell you the one that has always stuck with me. Near Promontory Point, like some distance from the rail line in the work camps on a ledge, a rock wall ledge, this is a mountainside ledge, a group of archaeologists about 30 years ago found a perfectly preserved Chinese rice wine bottle, for ngape, right? I'm probably not, thank you, I'm not saying it right. And there's no other artifacts from the Chinese up there. There are some Native American artifacts. The site had been used as a hunting blind by Native Americans prior to construction of the railroad. And then there's this bottle up there. And now I want to say, we don't know. We have no way of directly knowing how that bottle got there, but it sparked my imagination. Thinking about the work camps, how crowded they were, how tired people were at the end of the day. I thought of someone who maybe had a fight with their tent mate and took their bottle of liquor and went out into the desert, climbed up onto this ledge, sat there, looked at the stars, looked at the moon, had a couple drinks, maybe calmed down, went back to the tent. I thought maybe some guys got together, they went in for a bottle, right? Went up maybe to celebrate something, maybe someone got good news from home, maybe someone got bad news from home. We don't know. Or maybe it was just a situation where someone kind of liked to have some time to themselves, and one day they just decided after dinner, I'm going to just take a little break, and, hiked up the mountainside, sat on the ledge, looked at the railroad being built, looked at the light from the tent camps. That's just one artifact, and I'm telling stories because we'll never know exactly who brought it up there and exactly what they were thinking while they were sitting there on that ledge, looking over the railroad line, looking at the work camps and sipping from that bottle. But I think part of what archaeology helps us do is really connect with the humanity of people's experiences. Connie mentioned in her talk the way that Chinese railroad workers were often compared to swarms of insects or to animals, right? Or hordes, right? And with archaeology, we get the individual experience. We find rice bowls where people have pecked the character mark of their family name, or they've pecked a good luck symbol onto it. And you think about someone sitting around, maybe they were worried their roommate would use, their tent mate would use their bowl, or maybe they just wanted to, kind of peck a auspicious character into the porcelain to give them luck for the next day on the job. We see the medicines that they use to take care of themselves after such hard labor and exposure to environmental cold and wind and rain and snow. And I think that that's what means the most for me as an archaeologist, are those moments where I feel like I can actually tangibly just understand a little bit of the experience of the people who created the history we're talking about today. And then there's one very special artifact I think that you're referring to. Do you want to talk about that a bit? I do want to mention, though, I have another student in the audience, Jocelyn Lee, who was also on the project in southern China at Sangdong Village, where this artifact was found. And Veronica worked as a research assistant for the analysis of that collection. So do you want to talk about that?
Sure. So like all good archaeology projects, the most intriguing thing is found on the last day when you're wrapping up and trying to clean up and get home. So on the last day of surface survey, which is when we walk in a grid pattern looking for artifacts and other cultural remains, the team in Sangdong Village found this glass medicine bottle. And then later in the lab, when it was inspected more closely, it turned out it was embossed in both Chinese and English. And it came from the Abietine Medical Company in Oroville, California. And so many people who were in Marysville and Oroville this past weekend got to hear this already. But the intriguing thing about this medicine bottle is that by embossing the bottle itself, it's a manufacturing process in which the decision has to be made from the very beginning that the Chinese language and English language is going to be put on it. So someone in Oroville made this decision that they were going to send some medicine to China to try to sell it there. So that sparked this whole sort of question, like what kind of business networks, personal relationships have to happen to begin this sort of business enterprise. And so that led us to, we looked all around the North American West at extant herbal stores, Chinese medicine stores, and other museums for examples of this kind of bottle, and we haven't found a single one. So, activating the network here, if you ever come across a Chinese medicine bottle with both languages in Boston, which means it's at the time of formation formed, let us know, talk to us. But because we haven't found one, that suggests to us that this was made specifically for export. And this led us to dig into stories about the Qin family in Oroville. We have many members of that family here today. And sort of look into their experience. I'm not going to go, it's like a very long, involved story, so I'm not going to get too into it. But basically, I think what the railroad work sort of sparked was this opening of new research questions into broader experiences, relationships formed across the American West and back in the home villages. So, yeah.
Thank you, Veronica. Yes. Like any other exhibit or talks and whatnot, I think it raised a lot more questions than answers. And I'm glad we have this few of panelists with us, professors, historians, filmmakers, students. So have everybody visited the 6th floor?
Not yet.
Yeah?
No.
Who hasn't been upstairs? Okay, do go upstairs, 6th floor. The exhibit is going to be going on until May 22nd. Okay, tell your friends, bring your children, bring your grandchildren. Tell the school so they can bring the tours of students coming to see it. Any other questions? Some of us around, Nancy. We are Chinatown History and Culture Association. My wife Lee and myself are directors. We're glad to leave you some business cards if you want to talk further. You want to sign up on our list on the outside. We have a list outside. Leave your phone number, leave your email address. We'll be really glad to communicate with you. Tell us what next project, what else you want to see in San Francisco. Tell us, we're trying to see what we can do. So thank you, I appreciate everybody. Have a nice day.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming today. It's been our honor to bring this exhibition and these panelists to everyone. Hopefully in the future we can do more of discussions like this. And I would like to welcome Connie. Please come up and we can take a good picture. And our president, Dennis Yoktong, please come up to the panel so we can take a picture together. So if you like what we're doing, please have your information on right outside. Okay, so thank you. Thank you very much for coming. Hopefully looking forward to seeing all of you in the future.